we took a look at how to find out the yield to call in Excel, okay, which was exactly the same way of finding out the yield to maturity in a previous exercise. So the methodology is always the same. Of course, you have to remember, a lot of details about the characteristic of the bond, whether it is a straight bond or a bond with an embedded option. We have to know the face value of the bond, we have to know the bond price, the maturity, the frequency, and then when we have all this data, then we can find out the yield to maturity. So the essential thing is to be extremely careful of all the details involved, all the data, all the detailed data of the bond, right? Then once we have all the data of the bond and all the details about the bond characteristics, then we can find out the various yield measures. There are two more yield measures that we should mention, which are important for bond pricing. One is the yield to put, okay? So just as there is a yield to call for callable bond, there is a yield to put for puttable bonds, okay? So, and again, notice that the formula is exactly the same of bond pricing, but the only difference is that in the end, instead of having the maturity value, you have the price of the puttable bond, okay? And, it should also be noted that here the maturity is modified, okay? Because in the puttable bond, the bondholder had the option to extend the maturity. Another important measure is the yield to worst, okay? Sometimes it's quoted in the financial press. The yield to worst is basically the lowest of the yield measures applied to a particular bond, okay? So that's the yield to worst. Before continuing our discussion, we should also say something about risks. So far, to keep things simple and to really understand what is the dynamic of bond pricing, we've been ignoring all kind of risks associated to bond investments. But of course, in the real world, there are a number of risks, right, when that bond investors are facing on a daily basis. Let's take a look to some of them. The first one is the interest rate risk. So the interest rate risk is the risk of having capital losses. What does that mean? The interest rate risk is the risk that the bond value changes following a change in the yields or in interest rate. For example, suppose that you buy a bond and then after that the yield to maturity increases considerably, then that means that your price is falling because the present value of the cash flows is falling because the yield to maturity has increased. So if that happens, you're going to suffer a capital loss, right? If the interest rate increase after the purchase of the bond price, okay? And this kind of risk that you're facing is called interest rate risk. There is another kind of risk which is called the reinvestment risk, and the reinvestment risk is basically the risk that you're facing when it is the risk of not being able to invest all the future coupon payments at the initial yield to maturity. Okay, so that's called the reinvestment risk. Of course, zero coupon bonds don't have any reinvestment risk, right? They have because they don't pay any coupons, so there's no risk of reinvesting the future coupons at a lower interest rate. And then also, importantly, but this goes well beyond the scope of this lecture, there is the default risk. What is the default risk? It is the risk that the issuer will not make the promised payments to the bondholder.